Turn to Colossians chapter 1. It's interesting to me in light of the news yesterday and in watching the response, it strikes me that one of the first observations I make is people don't know how to handle it. Everyone knows they're surprised, but what do you think of it? Oftentimes we go to the extreme and think what it could have been and then back it off, but it's still, what do we do with this? It looks like things are getting to a frenzied response, and the sides are becoming more and more divided, and more people are confused. And you listen to the news and you read things online, and certainly it's never been quite this quick in all of our lifetimes as it is now, how fast we can read and see the responses and immediately get all speculation and all responses and all reactions all at the same time. It can look like utter chaos. In Don's personal opinion, and that's all this is, it's not even a political statement, but Don's personal opinion is it is chaotic. That generally speaking, nobody really knows what's going on now. So what do we do with that? We don't panic, do we? Because we understand that regardless of what's going on, and this has always been the case, and it always will be the case, our Lord, who we're about to get into more of the details that are described here, has not lost one tiny speck of control. It is all under his jurisdiction. You can look on it a couple ways: what he's ordained, what he has preordained, what he allows. However you want to look on it, either way, nothing slips out from under his control. One well-known speaker used to put it this way: there is no such thing as a rogue molecule in the universe. That's in any possible, and it's not just talking about the physical universe, as we deal with and will be dealing with in this text here in Colossians 1. He's not only creator of all the things, but he's even the creator of all the concepts and the authorities, the abilities. All of these things come from him. Any enemy of God, well, clearly they don't realize it, but any enemy of God is borrowing from God, in the case here, is borrowing from the Lord Jesus Christ to do anything that they do, even their ability to think through it, even their ability to breathe and to live. People were talking about just a few centimeters, what a difference it could have made. And that's a fair statement. So how do you handle things like that? Love the former president or not? It clearly would have had a tremendous impact on things, and likely the attempt itself will have it. But our focus isn't on these things. These are the second causes, they're often called in theological circles. This really helped me out when I started to come to grips with this real general concept in theology. First cause versus second causes. We're always focused on second causes as though somehow those are really the cause, like humanity, governments, circumstances. But in reality, it has never changed, even though some people struggle with the concept of the reality that God is the first cause, the ultimate controller of all things. And I know people don't like that, and they'll immediately raise their hand and say, well, does that mean evil? I think you're just ultimately saying God is the creator, God is the author of evil. And I've read those since I was young and struggled with that when I was in college. How do we balance this out? He can't possibly be the creator of evil. But as I've stressed before, and I need to clarify it carefully because I could see if anyone ever took interest, which I doubt they will, I could easily be soundbited into looking like I'm an absolute heretic. But in one sense, absolutely he did. And how did God ultimately become the author of evil? This isn't as horrible as it sounds like it could be. Some of you have heard me deal with this before. Because he defines good. Because of his holiness that Rick's been dealing with. Because of his righteousness. Then anything opposite to that. So just by defining this is good, this is right, then anything in contrast to that is evil. So yes, in that sense, even over evil and sin. Because, as I like to stress and ask, what's the alternative? That somehow evil is all on its own and rogue, and we're just glad that God's got a little bit more strength in this. But he's constantly having to react to whatever evil is doing. No. Even sin, even evil, will glorify the holiness the righteousness of God. So that doesn't change. That's why we're never in a panic. We're never concerned that somehow the right will lose. The right meaning righteousness, not the political right. Things like that. Again, Satan never wins at all. I put in my notes, I was looking over this, I don't know if we'll hit this or not. But the will of God is never thwarted, no, not in the least, not ever. It never is. It can't be if we understand and actually take at face value what's stated here. If all things were made by him and through him and for him, and all things means all things, and I looked at the Greek and it's not tricky wording there, it actually means all things, then how can we entertain that anything is ever out from under his control and that then something is there and we're hoping God's attention is drawn to it and that something is truly bad and we don't know what to do with it? Not for us. This is why we cling rightfully with everything we have to Romans 8:28, that all things work together for good. They really, actually do. That's not something we say, even though we know it doesn't. We just say it to make people feel better, but everyone that has eyes realizes it actually doesn't work together for good. I fear that that's often the case in our churches, that we don't actually believe it's the case, and yet it is. And I'm not saying this to try to make an unrestrained positive case in negative circumstances. I'm saying because we have no choice but to think that. With the text that we're dealing with here in Colossians chapter 1, let's read some of the context here. Speaking of what the Father did through Christ, verse 13, for he, the Father, rescued us from the domain of darkness, that's the darkness of evil and sin as well as blindness, and transferred us, so now we're totally made citizens of the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption. We've been purchased out of that tyranny, that slavery. How did he do it? The forgiveness of sins. How or who exactly did this? How do I know for sure this was done? How did he have the right authority? How do I know there's no loopholes? Great question. Here's the answer. Verse 15, he, speaking of Christ, is the image of the invisible God, which most people would think, yeah, okay, I get that. Even the cults would think, yeah, I think I can handle that. But we did deal with also Hebrews 1:3, he's the exact representation of God. So he is God, and he's the seeable, viewable God, if we want to put it more in our terms. But still, he's God totally. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, which is where we were at. That doesn't mean he was created necessarily at some point in eternity and then in time. No, he is the firstborn. In other words, he's the authoritative one. He's the one to whom everything is due, the inheritor of everything. That's speaking of the Lord Jesus Christ, the what people would have known in their culture, what firstborn also meant. If, for instance, we still had something like this, which we don't really have much of it anymore, but like in our family, Rick was the firstborn male, so any substantive inheritance we would have had, which we didn't have, he would have been the major beneficiary because he was firstborn. That's just the way it worked out. And that's the use of the firstborn here. He is the top of the creation. And then look at the details. Verse 16, for by him all things were created. Again, what does all things mean? I'm not trying to be cute. I'm just trying to stress it. It means everything. And he's about to describe what everything involves. For by him all things were created. Let's work on this all things here. In the heavens, that's in the universe, and on earth. Okay, that's pretty broad. Visible and invisible, the viewable and that which is not viewable or seeable. Not just what hasn't been seen, but even that which can't be seen. Whether, now he's dealing with the concepts and authorities, thrones or dominions, or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. And it doesn't stop. In case there's any gaps in our thinking, he is before everything, all things. And in him, everything's held together, which we'll deal with more at length, probably more at the start of next week's session there. So Dan, there's a heads up. Probably not today, but next week we'll deal with that. By him all things consist. By him all things are held together. They cohere is another term. He holds it all together. Thus, again, what I started, nobody can do anything but what they borrowed from him. I cannot hold myself together. If I say, I'm trying to hold myself together, you would understand my figurative meaning there. I'm just trying to keep myself together emotionally and in my thinking. But who of you would think, if I ever said that, he's trying to hold his cells together so they don't all fall apart? Well, none of us even goes there, because it wouldn't make any difference. Something holds me together. Something holds the floor together, the universe together, everything together, and that's the Lord Jesus Christ. You take him out of the scenario, nothing is held together. It all just breaks apart, fades away. So that seems pretty exhaustive, doesn't it? Complete. He is over everything, everything. Even the authorities that are out there, even the American electoral system, even that. It all fits perfectly within his working. It doesn't mean, again, that some people fear, well, Don, if you say that, people are going to get complacent and they're going to become fatalist and they're not going to do anything. You're just going to sit around and say, let him control everything. We know that's not at all a part of his ultimate control. We are commanded to be a part of these things, commanded to obey, but never losing sight. Everything's under his control. Everything. Both of those work together, but clearly one truth usurps the other. They're not equal truths. One is above the other. It's like people say, the will of man, the will of God, equal truths. No, they're not. One's clearly above the other. We don't struggle with that. That's obvious. Anyone that's at least somewhat honest in their thinking. So we were toward the bottom of page 8, begun point number 2 there, well through that though, but in and by means or through him, everything that was created was created. We dealt with the reiteration of that in John chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. If there was any obscurity there, you could certainly go there. Everything was created by him. There was nothing that was made that wasn't made by him. It's about as clear as it can be. I don't know why anyone thinks there's some obscurity here. He made everything. Everything, and not just the physical, the spiritual. And not just that, the conceptual, the order, the ideas, everything comes from him. We can't even come up with an idea that didn't come ultimately from him. Now, we distort them in sin, no doubt. But we get this ultimately from the Lord Jesus Christ. Not just God in some vague way we would say it. This text narrows it down so clearly. The Creator is the Lord Jesus Christ. People can say, I don't get that. I think the Father had a part in it. I agree. And the Spirit clearly did. I read that in Genesis. Yes, he did. This isn't competitive. But we realize Paul, especially dealing with Gnosticism, which we have variants to this day, even in our churches, makes it as clear as possible. I don't have any trouble with this. I just take it at face value, and maybe I'll be able to balance to some degree how the Father participated in the Spirit. But I do know it was the Lord Jesus Christ that created all these things. The same one who walked on this earth. The same one who seemed humble and not that attractive and was ultimately crucified. The one that just interacted with the people. He made everything, controlled everything. Even while he was on the earth, everything was still held together by him at that time. We have no reason to lessen this at any possible turn. This is important because I do fear sometimes we have a lesser view of Jesus Christ, even then a lesser view of the Godhead, in thinking that somehow once in a while, by my obedience, which I ought to do, by my love, which I ought to live by, that we're doing him a favor. Oh no. We are the recipients. God does not need our praise. He does not need our love. He does not need our attention. So when we were created to glorify him, it wasn't some deficiency in the Godhead. It was his benevolent generosity to share opportunities to glorify him. We're the beneficiaries. We get to do this. This isn't some task. Well, God just needs to be glorified. We have to hold up his ego somehow. Absolutely not. He didn't need us. We are 100% beneficiaries of this. And we'd better not forget it, because that's the case. It's why we should never become complacent in this. This is all for our good. God doesn't need us. As though somehow I might think, well, if he doesn't do this right or do what I want, I might rebel, or I might not pray to him, or I might not be as obedient as though God's, oh no. You know, like children sometimes try to manipulate their parents. And somehow I won't show you the love. I might reject you. I might not even look at you. Well, it's just immaturity. And hopefully no parent is intimidated by that. If we truly love, we don't need it reciprocated. We just love, which is what God did for us. So we ended with point D, speaking of things we have not seen. This is what is stressed in the next two inclusions into the all things that are described in these verses. All things visible, that's viewable, and invisible, what we cannot or what we have not seen. Both are included in that. There are things we might see later that we've never seen. They were included in that. And there are things we will never see. Just like I say, the soul. We don't see the soul. I know scientists tried to mess with this, that they see, well, I think we saw some emanation coming out of a person as they were dying, and that we think we have seen the soul. I don't know if that's the case. But we all know the soul exists, right? Something animates this stuff. Something animates us. Makes me move, makes me think, makes me talk. If you take my soul away, I'm just going to drop to the floor and it's just the carcass that's left. We know there's a soul, even though we don't see it. The Lord was the creator of that, even soul and spirit. I'm a tripartist, so I do believe there's three parts, even though it's tough to distinguish between soul and spirit. I still think it's there. He created all this and the interactions there. So point E, where we're at now, I didn't finish point D there, but might this include the entirety of the spirit realm? And of course it does. Of course it does. So point E, yeah, just considering the physical realm, so we'll just start there if we want to start to try to understand or at least come to some understanding of the magnitude of this. The farther we are able to see into space, we've heard this before, the farther we've been able to see into space, the more we see is there. I've always been interested since I was a boy in the stars and things like that. I've never been an expert on it. We bought a telescope last December, kind of as a family gift, and been dabbling into truly amateur astronomy. There's so many things there I don't understand or follow, but it's been fascinating to see all of these things out there. But I love to see the pictures, especially sometimes how they'll present it. There's this little spot, and you say, oh, look at all those stars there. A lot of little stars in this seemingly insignificant spot in space. Now, let's zoom in with our new cameras. The Webb telescope being one of those. And you zoom in, and wait a minute. Those aren't stars. Those kind of look like a little spirally thing. And there's all kinds of little spirally things. See my amateur coming out. The galaxies. And you zoom in even more. Wait, there's even more galaxies within galaxies, it seems. Or whatever they are. And the further we see, the more we see. And it's always been there. And you know where we could go next. If you go to from the telescope to the microscope, it's the same way. The more detail we see in seemingly insignificant things, the more there is to see. What a design. What a designer. All created by the Lord Jesus Christ. So the more we're able to see into space, the more we see is there. Countless galaxies in one small spot in the sky. And the more we're able to see using microscopes, the more we can see that was previously invisible to us. And there could even be more inside of those things. Dan could speak more to this, I'm sure. Maybe he'll allude to some of this more next week. The more we can see, the more that's there. And then you see what's there and you realize, wait a minute, there's even more that's there. I remember watching many years ago a documentary. I forget the name of the guy that did it. He wasn't a Christian. He was a politician more in political fields. I think he was Jewish. But we watched this video presentation that was given, and they had an animation of how our DNA and everything works. And I wasn't that impressed, I'll be honest with you. I thought, science, my brain starts to blur right away, sadly. But Dan and Sandy were with us. I think even Hayes and Vi were with us, and we were just doing it on a Wednesday night down in our little entertainment area, and we had it on the screen, and we're watching, and Dan got excited about it. Not that Dan never gets excited, but he seemed pretty particularly excited about this, that is an excellent representation of this. That is really good. And to me, it kind of looked fake because it kind of looked like little machines working their way up the DNA, whatever it was, strand. I try not to say too much because I quickly prove I don't know much about it. And the intricacies of all these things going on. And then once Dan started to get excited, I thought, yeah, well, that little weird thing that's going up and down the strand there, I wonder what's inside of that. It was like machinery at work. It didn't even look real. And yet there it was. We think we're so smart. Things like that ought to humble us, not just the further we look, but the more microscopic we look, that ought to truly humble. If ever a group ought to be unstoppably reverent of God, it ought to be scientists, at least biological scientists. They ought to be in awe of God based upon these things that we are able to see now. Off to the left, it would be arrogantly presumptive of us to think we have reached or could reach a point where we truly have seen it all. No, we haven't. The more we see, the more we realize there is to see. The more we know, again, as Dan has pointed out before in some illustrations he did in his presentations before, the more we realize as we grow the circle of our knowledge, the more around the perimeter of that we realize, wait a minute, there's so much more outside that we could learn. Rather than making us arrogant, it ought to put us in our place. I know so little, even though I know more than I've ever known in my life. That's exactly what it ought to be. And this is what Paul is doing now. You Gnostics, you come in here thinking you're so smart and so intelligent, and now you're going to bless Christianity with your great intelligence by somehow trying to box God into something and put restrictions on him. That's ridiculous. And yet we do it in Christianity all the time, maybe not in the physical or the science realm, but certainly in the philosophical or the practical realm, when we get upset with God. We don't think we need to obey. We're not as passionate as we ought to be, as Rick was stressing before. We're just not. And we think that's okay to be half-hearted about this. We don't even look on that sometimes as being one of the grossest sins that we participate in, and that's being half-hearted about these things. We at least ought to admit that. I ought to be more wholehearted in all this. So point F, bottom of page 8. Not only this, we could keep saying this, sounds like a commercial, doesn't it? And wait, there's more type thing. And not this, but there's this, and not that, but here's even more. Well, there's no way a commercial could even compete with this. It's not only just these things, which is way more than enough already. We could have stopped there and thought, okay, this is already beyond my ability to even begin to comprehend, but we don't stop there. Not only this, but he created the order, the structure, and even the concepts of order and structure. You ever thought about that? I love outlines. I love how it keeps thoughts going, and even though I'm not an expert in outlines, as many of you probably see quite often looking at my outlines, but he comes up with all this. He's the inventor of logic and order and structure and how things work and how they don't work. He came up with it. He knows it all. Be a good time to go back to that quote again that Mr. Louis Sperry Schaefer, I quoted him some time ago, that if we truly believe these things about God, why would we ever think that the creation as it stands now, the way things are as they stand now, are not perfect because the Creator is perfect? But we don't often think, well, look at the flaws there. I would have done it differently. Well, what do we know? I can't even describe what makes up this wood. And if I could begin to do it, if I delved deeper into it, I still couldn't work out the growth that came in, what holds it together and makes it solid, more solid than the air that's around it. I know there's air around it. I can feel if I move my hand like this. But the wood and its structure, I don't understand that. And as I mentioned, the growth and how it came about, and then the creativity of someone who came and cut it and formed it. There's so many things that immediately, if we just start to delve into them, they're beyond our ability to understand. We ought to be reverently humble people all the time, because really, what do I know? That doesn't mean we're defeatists and say, well, okay, I'm just going to be stupid through life and give up on learning. Oh, no, we keep learning and learning and learning because we're told to and because we ought to want to. But it never produces arrogance. Knowledge for knowledge's sake, Paul warned, puffs up. But true knowledge with understanding, knowledge with wisdom, as we've already dealt with in this text, is one that keeps us reverent and keeps us humble. Okay, but wait, there's more. Top of the next page. Not just objects, not just energies, but even authorities. That's spiritual and human authorities. That's his also. As conveyed in the words thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, these authoritative powers are from him and even for him. They're still under the jurisdiction of that for him. Even our government now, even the governments in all the other nations are from him and for him. Is it true he puts up one and puts down another? Yes, it is. All the time. However he sees fit. However he knows is fit. And who's going to question that? So nothing's out from under his control. That's why you hear things like we heard yesterday, and there's concern as a citizen and things like that, and wonder about what's going to happen, but never, ever even beginning to flirt with a despairing fear. Why would we? Has the Lord gone, he just wasn't paying attention for a moment. Ooh, that was a close call. Does our Lord ever have a close call? Of course not. I love that statement. It's so simple and yet so true. Has it ever occurred to you that nothing ever occurred to God? We need to remember that. That's a good summation. No, nothing ever has occurred to God because he's always known it all the time. Well, that's true. We should be the ones that burn with shame when we worry. Maybe unless, of course, we understand why we worry. I remember trying to analyze my own worry one time and thinking, well, I know the Lord's in control. I don't doubt that at all, but I'm still worrying, and I know what I'm worrying about. I'm worrying I won't like it. Okay, there we go. That's an attitude problem, not a control problem, right? It's sin. That's my issue. That's really where my worry is. Not that the Lord won't do what is absolutely perfect. I just may not like it. It might make me sad. It might make me angry. Okay, at least we deduce the issue there. These authoritative powers are from him. They are for him. There is no, and this is important. This just jumped out at me as like it's never before. There is no clarification of good or evil authorities. It just says all authorities. Evil too, yes. So, all are included under him. Again, I know a lot of people think, I've got trouble with that. Well, I'm sorry you've got trouble, but it says all, and somehow the Lord is even in control over evil powers. And yet those that are evil are the ones who get credit for the evil. And the Lord is the one in his infinite control, infinite wisdom, is responsible for his usage of these things for his glory. Yes, even Satan himself. And if we choke on that, I don't know what your alternative is. We can't possibly have another alternative. And we're not worried about these things, right? Unless, of course, we're worried about being disappointed. That doesn't fit my idea. God is so holy that he cannot even look upon evil. We'll like to go to that text. I get the understanding of that. But then we're going to run and try to balance that text out and say, well, then he could not have anything at all, of even having it be in existence. Oh, wow, I don't like where I'm going there already. We have to rein ourselves in and realize there are a lot of limits our minds are going to hit, our even sincere pursuits of faith are going to hit, and we'll realize, okay, I cannot fully harmonize it, but I trust the Lord. And woe is the person that thinks they can harmonize everything. Thus we have endless resources of theological books and documents out there that have just led people down the strangest paths. And then once we get comfortable with our own little niche of this one little tiny little strand of some deep theological thinking, now we divide over that. of things that are already beyond our ability to understand. There's plenty of stuff we understand, we comprehend, though we cannot fully explain them. That's okay. That's what it's like to serve an omnipotent, omniscient, all-powerful God. What else would we expect? That's why the older I get, I just don't feel burdened to go down a lot of these theological paths and come up with all these detailed explanations. I'm getting more and more comfortable saying, I don't know, but I do know what it says here. I know what I felt like the blind man there in John, early in John in chapter 6, or before that. They were trying to ask him, well, how do you think he did this? They want to put him on the spot. The Pharisaical leaders, the scribes and Pharisees, trying to say, how do you think he did this? I don't know, he said. I know once I was blind, but now I can see. And they ask him, remember this? Well, where did he come from? And they didn't know, and the blind man, probably getting himself into more trouble, said, well, here's an astonishing thing. A man that's done such great things, and you, the religious leaders, don't even know where he came from. That's pretty profound. Of course, that made them very angry. And he lost any standing at all with the synagogues, any privileged positions. I don't see him walking away sad and grieved. His parents certainly seemed concerned, but he wasn't. Some have noted that these terms, thrones, dominions, rulers, authorities, they've noted that these terms can refer to angelic or spirit powers and authorities. I found kind of inordinate amount of discussion about, well, this is talking about angelic authorities. Well, I don't understand why you're just going to narrow it to angelic authorities. It's all authorities. So yeah, I can handle that. I don't have much comprehension or understanding of all of how angelic authorities and the structures there work, but I do of earthly authorities. So I'm still a little bit more interested in that, in its interactions. Though I will yield that some have said, well, these angelic authorities do have influence over our jurisdictional human authorities, even regional authorities. Okay, I can yield that. But I don't understand what good we get out of it going any deeper than that. Well, I've discerned over the city of New York a certain type of spirit. I used to hear that. Rick probably remembers some of those discussions. Well, over this part of the United States, there's a spirit of lust. And over this part of the United States, there's a spirit of greed. Okay, seems like that's everywhere. I don't see any good that's coming out of this discussion. And yet here we go, down these paths. All of these things answer to him. If you look, because we certainly struggle with this a lot these days, in both extremes. I have seen some that when we dealt with COVID and things like that, there was back and forth on texts like this, Romans 13, especially Romans 13. Some saying complete obedience in every possible way. Others saying, no obedience, we can be defiant. And there was just no handling of it in its context and how it was supposed to be understood, but we certainly have a takeaway that all authorities are answerable to God. Now, we have certain tenets of Christianity right now that point to this text and say, see, these authorities are answerable to God. But they don't know that. They don't have to know it, but we do know they're answerable to God. And we have groups that are going to our government authorities and saying, I wrote them a letter and I told them, you are answerable to God, which is true. But what's interesting about the Lord's authority is the people that are under his authority don't even have to know it. This is why it's perplexed me over the years. I understand the motivation behind the people coming up with the discussions, what was commonly called lordship salvation. But it used to perplex me when I was in college and I heard this and I thought, but he is Lord. Whether somebody knows it or not. That's at least the broad answer. I get it that others think, well, I'm saved and now I can live however I want. But Jesus is Lord, and as Lord, he will usurp my will, even when I'm unwilling. Imagine that. That's part of sanctification. That's one of the wonders of it. That's why so much of our Christian growth is frustrating to us, because he's constantly usurping our will. That's not mean. That's a good thing when we look on it with the eyes of faith, as though somehow the Lord's saying, I can't do anything until you submit. You know, I've got it sitting there for the last 5 years. If you would just submit, then I could do something. as though God is up against the ultimate rival, the almighty will of man. No. Any of us know we can answer this just practically. I'm usurped in my will all the time. Look how frustrated I am and disappointed I am, and sometimes even thinking, I'm not so happy with God right now. Well, that's not a kindness of God. That's not God being unloving. That's God being God. And the issue isn't with him. It's not him being unloving. The issue's with us and my understanding of the authority structure here. There's just so many ways we can go at it, but this is why it's so important for us to understand it. Just the first 7 verses, Paul having to deal with this. Remember how good the government was in his time? We in the United States think, if we only had it as good as Paul did. You know, when he wrote Romans 13, remember how nice the governmental system was? People like Nero, pretty good leaders. You know I'm joking if you have any knowledge of history. You look back and say, it's pretty bad. I know the United States has gotten pretty bad at times, but it's not quite there yet. And yet Paul wrote this with a very bad, as it were, governmental system. Every person, verse 1 of chapter 13 of Romans, every person is to be in subjection to the governing authority. So we are in subjection, and we better understand that. Not because they're just great governmental authorities or because they have all the right answers, but because God made them. He made the positions. For there is no authority except from God. Well, does that really mean no authority except from God? I like to phrase it that way because it puts us in our place. There must be some technical answer. Let's not just keep repeating that phrase because it's kind of clear. As Tim likes to stress in the study in Revelation, it's not that so many of these things are unclear, it's that they are extremely clear. We just don't like what they're saying. And that's true, certainly with a text like this. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists, and that's that rebellious form, authority, has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. That's true. If you remember back during the whole COVID thing, handling of that, I tried to bring out the unique nuance of our governmental system that does seem to be rather unique over any governmental system that's come before. In that at least on paper, our governmental system is by the people, for the people, with some authority structure in a representative way. And there's where, there is a part in our governmental structure where we're not rebelling, we're not out from under subjection, but we do have a say, which is unique. That's why I didn't like those that said, no, utter subjection, everything they say we do. Wait a minute, let's remember our governmental structure. But then the other side, let's rebel in every possible way. And if they say to do something, we go the opposite. That wasn't right either in this text. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior. And I know a lot of people will say, well, they are now. No. Understand, this is God's design in it. They're not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Peter deals with this as well. Do you want to love life and see good days? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. Don't become someone who just finds their life purpose in challenging your governmental authority. I know that's not popular these days. And I know there is some degree we have that right and that privilege in our governmental system, but that had better not define us as Christians. It really shouldn't. That we're just out to defend our rights and everything like that, and that's going to be my bulk of my purpose on this earth. Do what is good, and you have praise from the same, for it, the government, is a minister of God. Do they know it? I highly doubt it, especially a lot of the ministers of God right now in governmental positions. I think they think the opposite. I think they are authority to themselves, and they are certainly not godly if they consider God at all. But it doesn't change what's stated here. They're a minister of God to you for good, but if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but even for conscience sake. Conscience based upon what? not the rightness philosophically or the genius of our government officials. It's not even talking about the people. It's talking about the positions. They are ordained of God. So conscience sake for what? Before my Creator, my Lord. He put me here. He put me under this. We could say, yeah, but the electorate's all over the place and they're voting or whatever, and I didn't vote for this. Yeah, but it's still there. And none of us would dare start to say, God lost control of this election. It clearly shouldn't have happened. Look at the conspiracies out there, and I know all these things happened. He couldn't do anything about it. Well, we wouldn't say that. Then why do we act like it? Nobody can win any office, ever. No one can be put into any position in a monarch or a dictator apart from God. So somehow, I can't explain it all. Please don't put me on the spot and say, well, here's how I disagree with it. I don't see how it's a minister for good, and I've got 15 examples to show you how it wasn't a minister for good. They were even killing Christians. Well, then what are you saying? This frustrates me to no end. So Romans 13 is wrong? Is that what you're saying? Well, no, I don't think I want to argue evidence against text. I know somehow, beyond my explanations, especially in some parts through history or anything, I don't see how it was good. But for God's usage of it, it was for good, and He knows what good is. I don't. We might think, well, having Christians put to death, that can't be good. And yet it is, if it's God that's doing it. Dan?
You referred earlier to, well, I don't even remember how now, but you referred earlier today to all things work together for good.
Mm-hmm.
And now governments are a minister for good, and we argue against both of those. The reason we argue against both of those is because we think we get to define good.
That's the problem. Right, that's the problem. And if we get back to that, it's that, well, it's not that God's not performing the good. We think we're the experts on what good means, and usually good means I like it. And bad means I don't like it, but that's not a good standard. There's a lot of things that are truly good and have been proven, even to our feeble minds, are good, and I haven't liked them. I admit tomorrow morning, I guarantee I won't look on it necessarily as being an agreeable good thing for me to have to get up and go to work. Mondays are particularly difficult. I don't want to go to work. But it's a good thing. It's a good thing, isn't it? Even though I don't necessarily wake up and think, oh, this is good. But it is good. So we see this constantly through our lives, and we don't think of it this way. See how much of this is of faith? Paul is just stating it clearly. Oh, it's all by Christ. Even the authorities that are, and I don't care if you throw in the angelic authorities and say, well, over this particular place is clearly evil authorities are over this. And they come up with the names of different angels and saying, this particular angel is over this realm. Well, it's still under Christ then. I don't know where you're going with this, but it's still under Christ. No matter how we look on it. Again, it doesn't produce a fatalism. It actually is supposed to produce a spirit within us that just will never quit regardless of the circumstances. And we'll keep moving forward because we're on the winning team. And even though it looks like we're losing at every possible turn, we've not lost 1 point. That's a fact. Not because of us or because of how we can explain it, but because of texts like this. It was all created by Him and for Him, even the authorities, even the concepts of these things, even the philosophical philosophies that have set up governments throughout history. Somehow, if it, some of the greatest growth of Christianity that we know, and no doubt that we'll never hear of until eternity, have come under oppressive governments. And some of the worst versions of supposed Christianity have come under the freest forms of government. So I think even just conceptually we can start to say, okay, all right, there is more out there than our definition of what we think is ideal, that somehow Christianity must have total freedom to flourish. Actually, historically, if we're going to try to generally look at it, it looks like Christianity has always done better with oppressive governments. I'm not voting for that as a citizen, but I'm not going to despair if it becomes more oppressive. This is where I understand the frustration as being a citizen. I don't like inflation. I don't like taxes. I don't like a lot of these things. But I'm never going to be bitter against God or stop thinking about the Lord altogether because my mind is so obsessed with how bad things have gotten. Okay, but they're not out from under His control. That keeps our attitude right. And it doesn't produce a fatalism. We do what we can in what we know is right in all of this. Point H, then, I almost feel embarrassed by using the word profoundly. It's already been profound, but here we go. Bear with my redundancy, my repetition. Then profoundly, wrapping this overview up, Paul states plainly that everything has been created through him, that's by means of him, and for him. Everything in the universe, physical and spiritual, living and inanimate, authoritative and subordinate, was created for him, for his purposes. And when we understand he knows everything to the molecular level and has control over every possible thing, that means for every possible detail of his purpose, even what happened yesterday. Nothing is out from under his control. That's a fact. That's what keeps us steady. Humanly speaking, I'll struggle with a lot of things I understand, but I understand why I struggle with them. My thinking is limited. I don't understand it. I don't like it. So where do I run to for strength and protection? I run to the truth. Because I won't like things that happen. There will be things that induce fear in us practically, thinking, oh no, our money might become valueless. We might end up with an oppressive government that seeks to take away our freedoms. We might even, as history has demonstrated, come up with an authority structure that kills Christians, that kills our families. That's not new in history. I don't like that. I don't desire it, but we will never even begin to flirt with despair because we know who's in control. Even if the horrific things happen. That's why we're never bitter people, angry people like we're seeing all over the place for a long time now. Early back in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, I'm just seeing it a lot where the politics has become overwhelmingly controlling, it seems, in our churches. That's what we want to talk about. I understand it. I like to talk politics. I like the competition back and forth, but it never should lead us to bitterness, hatefulness, even against the enemy, because they are under his jurisdiction also. Oh, I'll fight them philosophically the best I can. But we are never people of despair, never people of bitter anger. Ever. Not us. Because that would be to discount Colossians chapter 1, Romans 13, texts like that, or all the way back to Genesis chapter 9. Point H, that profoundly wrapping things up, everything was made through him and for him. Everything in the universe is under his control, authoritative and subordinate. Everything was created for his purpose. Therefore, off to the left, a significant part of this purpose is that he be glorified. We don't miss that. People quote these in their creeds and their confessions all the time. The purpose of life is that God be glorified. So much so, it's stated so oftentimes people can say it in a monotone voice. All things were made to glorify God. What's the purpose of mankind? We were here to glorify God. Well, that's the fact. That's actually the truth. That's undeniable. We're here to glorify God. All these things will ultimately glorify him. So the significant part of all this purpose is that he be glorified. Literally, everything is for this glorifying, and will ultimately do this. Everything will glorify God. I've used this illustration probably way too much, but it was a pivotal point in my thinking when I was studying for a doctrinal paper I had to put together. I think it was my first year of doctrines. And I read that statement, and at first I reacted to it, but wow, did it free me up in my thinking. That even the screams of an eternal hell will glorify God. And I remember where I was at in the library reading that. I don't remember who wrote it. And I remember thinking, I don't like that. But then I tried to argue against it. And I realized, okay. Now it's not a yin and yang like all the other religious and belief systems are out there. It actually is a sovereign God. He actually, even over the evil, even the people that will spend eternity. And I think, well, I don't like it. Well, it's not about me liking it. It's not about me justifying. Well, I don't like a God that would do that. Well, you're not God and you're not holy. Let's at least come to admit that. Well, yeah, I guess that's right. And you're certainly not omniscient. So I don't think we should be so quick to make these judgments, especially with any authority. I do not like the concept. I would never worship a God that would have an eternal lake of fire, like one well-known Seventh-day Adventist has stated openly many times. I would never, there could not possibly be a God that would have an eternal condemnation, an eternal hell, eternal lake of fire. Well, then I don't know who you're worshiping. And I don't say that because I want it. I don't. Humanly speaking, I might say, yeah, I think I would prefer annihilation. If they're going to reject God, okay, they don't want to go to heaven. Annihilate them so there's no consciousness, nothing left. But that's not the case. They are in torture, they are in pain, they are in agony forever. Well, that's not a human concept, and any of us would think, well, there's what I think I'm going to sell God as, but that is God, and we are here to tell the truth, not a version of the truth that will win people at the exclusion of parts of the truth, which I fear the gospel has become in some circles. So point I, it makes perfect sense then to realize that everything has purpose. And that purpose centers on Him. I don't define it. I don't even know it all. I probably know very little of even the purpose for me. And yet we have a society, even in Christian circles, that says, my purpose. What is my purpose in life? Oh, the purpose of me. And I hope other people recognize it and know they're all of it too. And I want to be in all of it. I wish this was sarcastic exaggeration, but it's not. I can't tell you my purpose. I know the general purpose of my life, but I'm not even quite sure what my detailed purpose is tomorrow. I think, well, I know for sure it's to get up and go to work. I might die tonight. Okay, well, that's a bit gloomy. Okay, I might be really sick tomorrow. I'm supposed to travel to go to something for Tuesday. The car might break down, and every car might break down. We might have roads. I mean, there's so many things that could happen. We say, well, but that's not the normal, but they could. And we have to constantly realize, I don't even know the particulars of my purpose tomorrow, let alone the rest of the day. Because it's for Him, by Him, through Him. This is what it's all about. This is a restful thing. Because so many people say, well, I don't think I have much purpose right now. And that's why I'm struggling with depression. Well, wait a minute. I know this doesn't comfort us all naturally, but who are you to determine if you're living a life full of purpose right now? Can you and I, as believers, knowing what we know, ever get to a place where we say, I have no purpose? No, that's actually sinful. That's wrong. Because who determines my purpose? I don't. Well, I've been undisciplined or whatever, and that's why I'm not. No. Let's not give too much power to our disobedience as though somehow God can control things as long as we're obedient. But wow, if I ever am disobedient, God no longer has control. Where do we go? We do this all the time. I've heard this a lot, even when I was younger, and that really is a tough one to deal with. I love that God has all these things, but look at how I'm always in the way. Until we start to read these texts and realize, no, I can't even thwart the purpose of God in my life. Now that's freeing. Does that make me want to go out and sin? Interestingly enough, no. That actually frees me from despair and even the possibility of it. I could be sick in bed all day tomorrow, and my life is full of purpose. Maybe it'll be to all the people that have to minister to me. Who knows what it could be? I mean, we're the ones that come up with these examples of, well, I can think of a purposeless scenario. No. There is no purposeless scenario. It is for me. I can't define it. I don't know what it is. Seems to be contradictory to what I think my purpose is, but it certainly doesn't mean there is no purpose. It was all created by Him, for Him, through Him. Therefore, I cannot imagine no purpose. Now, granted, my disobedience, we could say, well, fine, I'm going to go disobey. Well, one thing's for sure, my disobedience and the purpose in it will be to suffer greatly. and be in pain and be discouraged and be really sad. I'm not going to be the beneficiary of it necessarily from my own vantage point, but the purpose of God is never thwarted. Even by the greatest rebel there's ever been, they still glorify God. That's why even Satan, every knee will bow and say, Jesus is Lord, but we all know when he says every knee will bow, it doesn't mean, okay, in eternity, in Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats, well, now the goats are bowing and saying Jesus is Lord because every knee will bow. Now they're all saved. We know that's not the case. Even everyone, no matter how evil they've ever been, will have to admit the fact Jesus is Lord. There'll be no denying it, even by the worst of enemies of God. No, that's good news for us. It's really good news for us. And certainly helps keep my attitude in check, my will submissive if I keep thinking about it. And then when I'm not, it's not like I'm going to spiral out of control. You know how many Christians are out there? I just know someday I'm going to rebel. I'm going to spiral out of control. I'm just constantly living in fear. That's not biblical. Might I try to rebel? Yes. But why do we dismiss texts like one of my favorites? In many reasons why it's one of my favorites, but Hebrews 12. That'd be like me going to my dad when he was still around and I was a boy and saying, Dad, I'm so afraid, I'm so afraid. Why are you afraid, Don? I just know I'm going to rebel. And I'm going to disappoint. I just know it's going to happen. How do you think my dad's going to respond to that? Oh, wow. No, I'm a little nervous too. No, I'm confident what he would have said because he said it in so many different ways. Try it. Not in a, sincere way to go out and try to rebel. But let's see how far you take this. There were so many times getting in trouble, especially with my dad, where it was very, very clear I had no option. And that was because he loved me. And because he was my dad. I had no option. Even though I liked to entertain, I did. And the more I would try to practice my freedom, the more I realized I didn't. Do I resent him for that? Do I hate him? Of course not. I'm thrilled. And certainly God is far more insightful than my dad was. He knows everything. He knows my thought afar off. How am I ever going to get around that? So these are comforting texts. And certainly thwart the pride of the Gnostics and the intellects that would try to pit their genius, as they see it, against God. We're going to get into next week his timeliness, so in other words, above time, and sustaining power. There in verse 17, he is before everything, and in him everything is held together. And then it brings it to one of the most remarkable transitions. I've stated this last week, but one of the most remarkable transitions, in my opinion, and he's the head of the church. Now, suddenly, the church is immeasurably elevated because of his association. This God of the universe is the head of the church? Yes, that's pretty impressiveness. So his timelessness above time, his sustaining power. Just number one there, to be creator, he had to be before the world and the universe. Boy, now I'm delving into deep philosophy, right? No, hopefully all of us think, well, that's not profound. Well, yeah. To be creator, he had to be before everything. And to be before everything, he could not be made up of anything originally that is in this creation. Even in Romans 1, the things that exist now were not made out of the things that exist. That's plainly stated in Romans 1. That's Don's real basic translation of that. But that's what it says. The things that exist were not made of the things that exist. Because they were made by the Creator out of nothing. He was something, but I mean as far as matter and things are concerned, out of nothing. Even in John 8:58, we know John chapter 1 certainly did it, but the one that really roused the Jewish leaders there before Abraham was, remember how Jesus answered that? Before Abraham was, I'm going to misdo it. Before Abraham was, I was. No, that's not what he said. Before Abraham was, I am. Bad grammar or an eternal concept that blows the mind that made them realize he equated himself with God? Yeah, it's B. Not bad grammar. But he stated it in a way that fully identified, and they knew it because they picked up stones to stone him. There in John chapter 8. Before Abraham was, I am. And so we realize this is not a new concept to us. We may not have thought of the details that are laid out here in Colossians chapter 1, but what a wonderful, wonderful text to keep us in line and to certainly keep our hope where it ought to be. And then you and I realizing I don't define my purpose, the Lord does, so I'm looking to him at all times, which is one of the things that keeps us in the Word that Rick was stressing this morning, because there's where my purpose is. If I'm going to be clued into anything, he'll work with or without me fully understanding. I kind of want to be in the know. I'd like to see generally where things are going, since he's the one that's actually in charge.